today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the U.S. puts more pressure on Iran to change its behavior.
Today, I'm happy to announce the creation of the Iran Action Group.
Will Washington and Tehran's war or words escalate into something lethal? And our exclusive interview with philosopher Dermot Moran will explore how philosophy fits in a world with AI and social media.
Great achievements of both China and Greece is that they produce philosophy as the highest expression of the cultural wisdom.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our program with the White House's latest pressure to go against Iran. The U.S. State Department has rolled out what they call Iran Action Group to pressure the country to change its behavior. Iran believes this is a thinly veiled attempt to topple their government. Elsewhere, in accordance with the Iran nuclear deal, Russia has transported a batch of enriched uranium to Iran for energy purposes. Can the Iran deal be revived? Before we get down to our discussion, take a look at this.
Addiction to sanctions is how Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif described the U.S.'s latest moves. He said that sanctions may produce economic hardship, but will not produce political outcomes in Iran. On Monday, a spokesman of the Iranian Foreign Ministry called the formation of the Iran Action Group by the U.S. State Department an attempt to drive a psychological war by the warmongering U.S. government.
This behavior is in contradiction to all recognized international regulations and is hostile towards the Iranian nation and the life of the Iranian people. I believe that it will not get them anywhere.
Meanwhile, Russia has returned a second batch of the 20% enriched uranium to Iran. This was sent to Russia in 2015 as part of its commitment under the nuclear deal. Last Thursday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the creation of the Iran Action Group to execute the administration's Iran strategy for addressing all manifestations of the alleged Iranian threat.
The Iran Action Group will be responsible for directing, reviewing, and coordinating all aspects of the State Department's Iran-related activity, and it will report directly to me. Our hope is that one day soon we can reach a new agreement with Iran, but we must see major changes in the regime's behavior both inside and outside of its borders.
Pompeo named Brian Hook, who is currently the State Department's Director of Policy Planning, to run the group with the title of Special Representative for Iran. Washington left the Iran nuclear deal 3 months ago and reimposed sanctions on Iran's non-energy sectors earlier this month. The U.S. will slap the remaining sanctions on areas such as energy, shipping, and ports on November 5th.
On the issue of Iran, we are joined in Beijing by Ambassador Hua Liming, former Chinese ambassador to Iran and a distinguished research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Good to see you, sir. Also joining us in Beijing, we have Einar Tangen, who's our current affairs commentator. Good to see you. In Moscow, we invited Mark Slobodka, an international relations and security analyst. And last but not least, in Tehran, Iran, we have Hamed Musawi, professor of political science with the University of Tehran. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. I want to start with you, Professor Musawi. Obviously, you see the United States is putting sanctions against Iran, and that is causing also quite some political discussions within the Iran political circle. For example, the finance minister being targeted right now. How do you think the sanctions are likely to impact on domestic politics in Iran?
They will definitely impact domestic politics, and the reason is because the administration of Hassan Rouhani essentially came into power 5 years ago on a mandate to improve Iran's economy vis-a-vis a nuclear deal. And of course the Rouhani government was able to reach the nuclear deal with the international community. Nevertheless, since the United States has decided to withdraw from the nuclear deal, a lot of the sanctions that had been lifted are coming back. And even though Iran is trying to continue the nuclear deal with the Europeans, as well as the Russians and the Chinese, Iran is finding that a lot of companies are actually leaving Iran. And this is non-American companies, because the United States is threatening them with sanctions.
Right.
Now, if this trend continues and Iran's economy deteriorates, then that would have negative consequences for Rouhani's administrations and Rouhani's political backing, especially in the parliamentary elections that are going to be held next year.
That's true. Ambassador Hua, this is not the very first time, of course, that Iran faced the U.S. sanctions. This is not the biggest scale either that Iran has ever faced the U.S. sanctions. But the question is, this is already the first time after the Iranian nuclear deal that has been done. So what is likely, do you think, its impact on the domestic politics in Iran? Is that going to be the most dangerous thing for Iran?
Of course, this is very serious sanctions against Iran. But Iran has been sanctioned for decades, from the very beginning. But
when you were there, sanctions were there.
When I was there, the sanctions started. So actually the Iranian government and the Iranian people, they got used to that kind of life. And they learned many ways to deal with that.
Like what?
Of course, like the oil export. Oil exports, well, from time to time was banned. But Iranians, they had found their ways to export their oils by this or that way. So even their military equipment, they could get it from the market. And you know, they don't have the Boeing planes, they don't have the Airbus, but they got the spare parts from everywhere of the world. So I think really it's very serious for Iran and for Iranian people, but Iranian had gotten used to that.
I see.
I lived in Iran when during the war between Iran and Iraq. That was a very hard time and much worse than the situation today, but they lived.
But the world has also been changing, I have to say. Mr. Sloboda, from Russia's perspective, on the one hand, Russia and Iran have been working together, I mean, at least on the issue of the United States, but on the other hand, Russia and Iran are both oil exporters. So there's quite a complex, people say, mixed feelings coming from Moscow about the latest sanctions the U.S. has toward Iran. Mr. Sloboda.
Yeah, first of all, I think it needs to be said that these sanctions are not just against Iran. The United States is sanctioning European companies, including European state companies. It is sanctioning Turkish companies. It is sanctioning Russian and Chinese companies. It is sanctioning anyone who dares, in their estimation, to do normal business with Iran. In fact, it's sanctioning its own allies in the government it installed in Iraq. It's sanctioning Iraqi companies, which is not going to improve its relations with that company either. Russia regards Iran as a firm strategic partner and ally. They have a mutual defense pact with the company. They do have numerous energy deals between the two of them, Russia helping develop Iran's energy fields, as well as nuclear deals with Russia building Bushehr, Iran's nuclear power plant, and helping them maintain and working forward with Iran's completely legal nuclear energy program, as is their right as a state under the nuclear non-proliferation treaties. So Russia regards this unilateral move by the United States pulling out of a UN Security Council approved treaty as very unwise and destabilizing to the entire region in the world.
Well, Mr. Tangen, since you are coming from the U.S. originally, probably I pose some question to you about that as well. It is not just the U.S. sanctions against the countries who are dealing with Iran, but also the U.S. has been quite active in approaching other partners. For example, Israel. We have seen John Bolton has been meeting with Netanyahu coming from Israel this week. So what do you make of the next step do you think that Washington could have about Iran, given the fact this is already the heaviest sanctions, and yet we are seeing midterm election coming up? So Iran, will that be used further as a political stake for Donald Trump for exchange it with other political gains?
Well, it's quite possible. You know, the guessing game in Washington, D.C. is what will Donald Trump do next. Just when you think that it's impossible, he does something that defies convention. And this is exactly what it is. I mean, breaking an international treaty unilaterally without giving any reason other than, quote, I don't like it, is not useful. But this idea, the Iranians are having the same problem that everyone else is having, and that is exactly what does the U.S. want? In some instances, people are saying, look, I don't think they want anything. I think they just want to be dominant, and they want everyone to surrender. Basically, it's kind of like South Korea. They signed a FTA with the United States very quickly when they were negotiating the North Korean crisis, but only later do we find out that they're subject to 301 investigations. So this is a very chilling thing for most countries. They just say, he doesn't want anything. He wants to impose his will. There's a strong feeling that the U.S. feels it's running out of time and that it needs to exert its authority while it still has strength.
Well, at the same time, having what you just said, Professor Musawi, how shall we, or shall we understand Iran's realities now? I mean, Iran used to accuse the United States of not necessarily implementing the policies and the promises and not being credible, and now it seems that the rest of the world has also recognized that, at least under this administration so far. So does it bring less burden, moral burden at least, for Iran? Will that create any kinds of further opportunities for Iran to break the current sanctions? Or just no matter what, the U.S. still have the dominant voice already, and therefore Iran, as it used to be, has to go through this round of sanctions as it always been?
Yes, so it's very true, as you point out, that there is a very severe mistrust of the United States within Iran. And the reason for that is because the current nuclear deal is the result of several years of intense diplomacy, and it was actually enshrined in a United Nations Security Council resolution, so it is actually international law. Nevertheless, the United States decided to withdraw, even though Iran was completely abiding by the deal according to the IAEA, which has actually published 11 reports in that regard. So the issue right now is, if the United States cannot be trusted regarding the current deal that we have, how can we negotiate on another deal, as Donald Trump points out, as a supposedly more comprehensive deal? How can we trust the United States in abiding by a new deal when it's not even abiding by the current deal? And as you point out, I think the entire international community, except for Saudi Arabia and Israel, have realized that. And actually, Iran is trying to continue the deal with Russia, China, and the Europeans. The Europeans are actually currently working on a package of economic incentives for Iran to keep the deal. Nevertheless, we have to point out that the Donald Trump administration is really acting like a very big bully in this regard, and they are even bullying the Europeans.
But for now, we've seen, Mr. Tenget, the United States should see that Iran is building fighter jets, it's building missiles, as a result of the insecurity of America's lack of credibility to implement some of the international agreements, for example, the Iran nuclear deal. And Iran does have more moral, in a way, moral support coming from the others as a result, because of the U.S. lack of credibility. So do you think Washington understand that what's going to be the next step could be also devastating for Washington itself in the longer term, which is being discarded as irrelevant?
Well, this is
or somewhat irrelevant. Let's just be pragmatic here.
Well, isolated, I think, is the correct term. I mean, the United States has tremendous resources. It could go back to it, but it's putting itself in a position internationally, not just with this issue, but with many other issues, the trade tariffs, etc., where it is increasingly on the wrong side of the international community that it built. Every multilateral entity in the world was, in essence, spearheaded by the U.S., and now they are rejecting it. So this brings this trust and credibility issue into line.
Right. But Ambassador Hua, I have to be frank here. We are pragmatic when you are talking about international relations, right? We all know interests aligned people and countries together. So what about that? If the United States is not an active participant in the current round and maybe future discussions, will the other nations of the Iran nuclear deal be able to shoulder that responsibility? Obviously, the Europeans are a little bit hesitating.
The European governments cannot control the companies. So the first to leave Iran is Total, the oil giant of France. Just the next day of announcement of Donald Trump, Total left, Siemens left, and the Airbus left, and many the French companies left, because they have their interests, they have their benefits in the United States much more than Iran. They have to balance. Choose one.
That is the reality. What about the reality check coming from Russia? Of course, this means Russia could play a bigger role in the previously known as JCPOA deal. At the same time, Russia could also have more opportunities into the Iranian economy as a result of Western companies withdrawing from Iran. But it's a mixed picture, some would say. Mr. Sloboda, much chance?
Yeah, it is a mixed picture, and certainly Russia values regional and global stability on the issue, considering we're dealing with a nuclear-armed U.S. and one of the major Middle East powers here. European companies are not shielded by the EU's protection measures. These are outdated measures in a world of mobile capital flows, and the U.S. controls the global heights of the financial system. So most of the major European companies, whether we're talking French Total, Germany's Alliance, they have already pulled out or are pulling out of Iran because they don't want to be cut off from global capital flows by, financed by the United States. So in a large way, the Europeans are not going to be able to fulfill their economic commitments as part of this regardless. Now, Russia and Chinese companies are somewhat more insulated from this, from years of sanctions against their own countries by the United States. In fact, the U.S. is either sanctioning or tariffing a good portion of the world in an economic war right now, and Russia and China are already fairly insulated from this. So there is room for Russia to gain, and perhaps even Turkey, to gain footholds, particularly in energy and other businesses in Iran, as the Europeans pull out. And in fact, the U.S. is obviously moving towards conflict with Iran. They're setting up special operations centers in the State Department, and they've already done so in the CIA. They're building up this Mujahideen Khalq, MEK, this terrorist group in Albania, where Giuliani and Bolton and Nancy Pelosi have all spoken about regime change in Iran. They're obviously moving there. I don't think they'll actually be able to regime change Iran, and Russia faces the prospect that they are allies with Iran, but conflict in the region is going to raise global oil and energy prices quite high, which will conversely benefit both the Russian and the Iranian economies.
Having said that, though, what about China? China is certainly one party of the six JCPOA. Well, at the same time, we have seen, Mr. Ambassador Hua, there has been reports coming out suggesting Chinese companies doing legal business with DPRK companies that are being, in a way, sanctioned by the United States. We have just heard that news coming from the weekend. So obviously China is also vulnerable, but at the same time China wants to be insisting on the issue of Iran nuclear deal. So how will China keep that balance, Ambassador Hua?
In bilateral relations between China and Iran, for 40 years, there has been always an American factor. China has been always under pressure of the United States to have something more than the United Nations Council. So this time, naturally, I think Donald Trump's administration will ask China to follow whatever the U.S., but I don't think China will 100% follow what the U.S. has done. And one Chinese oil company has been sanctioned during the 2012. And one Chinese bank, Kunlun Bank, has been sanctioned too. So I think it could happen.
But China is ready for that.
Yes, I think so.
All right. Mr. Tengen, about that also, we see that the U.S. is setting a very bad precedence about how to work on the nuclear deals, with JCPOA being scrubbed off by the current administration. Nobody expects that the U.S. would follow its moral standard, if it still has one, on the DPRK issue. Secondly, you also see the businesses being disturbed further as a result of the latest round of sanctions. Thirdly, we see not only the U.S. is coming in as a disruptor toward the international trade mechanism, but also to some of the important trade interactions bilaterally, other countries with other countries, for example, with Iran, coming from the European countries. So these three layers are put together. Many really question even further about the U.S. credibility. Not just scrap off JCPOA, but further, even impose further sanctions, the largest scale of sanctions toward Iran this time. Mr. Tengen.
Well, this question about what the United States wants under Donald Trump is something that bothers everybody. And as I alluded to before, there are many people in the government, in the U.S. government, who feel that this is the U.S.'s last chance to hold political, economic, and military hegemony, and to use that to keep itself in place. If it waits another 10 years, there will be no opportunity. China and the rest of the world will have grown to such an extent that it will be impossible for the U.S. to impose their will. Now, what's behind this? A lot of people say it's selfishness, but there is an ideological component, this American exceptionalism, this idea that the whole world should fit into a little neat post office, which is democratic capitalism, liberal. So this is, in theory, what's going on behind this. It's just not as clear that it's very well demarcated. You cannot go around using this kind of playground bully exercise and think that you're going to get the rest of the world to willingly follow you.
All right. Well, we have to wrap it up over here, but thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. I know the situation will evolve, and certainly we are going to tap on your doors for your expertise once again. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the four of you, for being with us. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me. Still to come on our program. When we speak to philosopher Dermot Moran, we examine how Eastern wisdom and Western doctrine can be combined to resolve, possibly, some of the global issues we're facing right now. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Ranging over time and space with astonishing agility, the world has transformed in leaps and bounds over the past 2,500 years. Although the world faces momentum challenges, the development of technology has accelerated to meet them. But some inventions, like social media and AI, have us pondering where civilization is heading for. Can philosophy, defined as the love of wisdom, answer some of our most profound questions, or is it outdated? During the 24th World Congress of Philosophy in Beijing, I sat down with Dermot Moran, president of the International Federation of Philosophical Societies. He shared with us his insights between the ties of philosophy and our world. It's chaotic, many believe, today's world. But the question is it to a philosopher?
The world has mostly been chaos for philosophers, and that is why they are looking to understand it. Because many philosophers in the West and the East, they flourish in a time of crisis, because they are forced to come up with new ideas to resolve the problems. Well, I think a good example was that in the ancient Greece, Socrates was condemned to death because his ideas did not suit with the city of the time, and he was possibly the most prominent thinker. Plato was exiled. He was even kidnapped for a while by pirates. That's in the West. And St. Augustine was writing his great book, The City of God, when the barbarians were attacking Rome. So Hegel was writing one of his books when Napoleon was sending cannon fire into the city. So they're writing in a time of war, often.
Many of them were, quote-unquote, the stars of their generation and their time. Could they still be?
I think this is one of the great achievements of both China and Greece, is that they produce philosophy as the highest expression of the cultural wisdom. These traditions, East and West, produce philosophy, a kind of self-reflection. And that requires very little except just the capacity for people to talk and to think. So it's somebody will say it's something that you use a mobile art form. You can bring it with you when you are traveling. So from that point of view, philosophy is a high expression of culture. Is it still? Well, I think that's the big challenge today, that since the development of the technological sciences, people in some respects are dominated by news and the everyday cycle of political events, and they don't have time to step back to reflect. But it's still necessary that they do so. So I think philosophy is still required.
Are you blaming the technologies?
I think that perhaps philosophers were slow to recognize the threat that technology was imposing upon the human life. We thought it was just another instrument to use. But we didn't realize that with this, it's not just a change in the tool, it's a change in the whole context of learning and understanding. And we really still don't understand that, how that is working for us. And I think that there's probably great opportunities, but also great threats in the use of technology, especially for philosophy.
I'm getting worried. Are you saying philosophers still could not grasp exactly what is the essence of technology these days and how they are actually transcending our lives or transforming our lives?
That was actually, that very title, The Essence of Technology, is an essay by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And he made that exact point, that philosophy gave birth to science. So philosophy thought it understood science. But in a way, with technology, which is a kind of second byproduct of science, we created a monster that we don't understand anymore. This is the, you have many stories of science fiction of the scientist who creates a monster. And in a way, we created this monster called technology. Now, we can't go back. We have to use it just like the way we have to use electricity. We're not going to go back to some Stone Age or Dark Age. But we need to reflect on how our nature itself is being challenged by this new technology.
Are you being challenged?
Very much so.
As a philosopher?
Yes, because I believe Heidegger here is correct, that he said that technology isn't just a tool, it's a new framework, and it affects all our thinking. Actually, he thought it was probably going to lead to the end of philosophy. I don't agree with that. I think that philosophy will continue, but it will have to make some kind of accommodation with technology. And in one way, one aspect of this has been, for example, the environmental movement. And the other one is the theme of this conference. How do we keep our humanity in this age of what they call post-humanism?
Exactly. We've been talking a lot, if you look at the world, artificial intelligence. So people, actually, many of the jobs, many of the skills, many of the talents can be duplicated. And probably the robots could perform even better than we do in a small given time. So that also makes us to think, what is the real essence of being a human being? The values, the wisdom, the interconnectedness, our relationships. And I wonder whether philosophy could really catch up with the time.
Well, I think that's required. I mean, let me give you an example. We've had some successes in philosophy.
Okay. Give me some sunshine.
All right,
there
here's
we
one.
go.
Here's one.
All right.
At a certain point, every culture had slaves. And after many, many discussions, it has become now the common view that slavery is wrong. And that was largely due to the arguments of the philosophers. And for the same reason, we now have to ask ourselves...
What was the argument?
Well, the argument was that they were all essentially human beings, that there were not two levels of human beings, but that we are all equally human. And actually that argument was already there in ancient Greece. There was already some arguments against slavery in ancient Greece. Aristotle argued in favor of slavery, but others argued against it. But by the 18th century, the argument was strongly accepted against slavery. Okay, so, however, we haven't been very good at, in relation to recognizing, for example, the rights of animals. Higher animals that are very close to human beings deserve better treatment than we have given them. Probably that's coming next. And then the next question will be, should we extend some kind of rights, as it were, to robots and to artificial life forms? Well, I think we're a long way from that, but I think we'll have to face that challenge.
Professor Moran, if you think about philosophers in ancient times, they are talented in all ways. There are scientists, there are philosophers, there are archaeologists, they are architects, they are everything.
Yes.
Which means cross-subject has been the nature of philosopher.
Yes.
For a long time until recently.
Yes.
Are we going to see that once again?
That's my view of philosophy. As you know, philosophy in the past was exactly what you said, that Aristotle, for example, it not only was a great philosopher, but a great biologist, especially of marine biology. He was extraordinary. But leaving that aside, now, of course, science has grown so fast that no one person could know all the sciences. So now philosophy is a kind of meta-subject. We are looking like an overview of what science does. We can't expect the philosopher to also be a great physicist and a great astronomer and archaeologist. But we can hope that philosophy will have an overview. By the way, it still does in the universities, because PhD means Doctor of Philosophy. And so it means that philosophy is still the name for the advanced knowledge in whatever area.
If you got a chance to ask an ultimate scientist one question from a philosopher, what would you ask?
What is meaning?
Wow.
That's what I would ask.
Do you think is that their subject?
I think that scientists normally forget that they are working in the domain of meaning. And they think they are working with things that are outside in the real world. But in fact, we only understand the world through our own categories and meanings. But we don't know how we produce them. So actually, in a lot of the sciences now, they say consciousness is the hard problem. I think an even harder problem is the problem of where does meaning come from.
The other thing is about geopolitics. The reason why we see the world in such a chaotic situation right now is because this is almost the very first time after the Cold War that ideas to begin their fight. And there are newcomers, new kids on the block, and therefore the existing system feels being challenged. Professor Moran, of course in history, this is nothing new. And yet, to a philosopher of today, is there some wisdom that we can really rely on?
Well, I think you're right that these changes have been going in cycles for many thousands of years. I mean, I am a child of the post-Second World War period, and in Europe, the building of the concept of a Union of European States. And they are still struggling with this idea.
And the baby boomers in the United States.
Yes, and they had this idea of peace and protest against global wars and so on. And in the 60s, for example, there was again, philosophers, by the way, led the campaign against nuclear armament. So clearly that philosophy has always responded to these challenges. But at the same time, philosophers have tried also to understand, is there some kind of logic, perhaps a dialectic, as Hegel or Marx called it, in these movements. Sometimes, like during the Roman Empire, or indeed in the Chinese emperor times, everyone fell under one rule or one language. And then it splits into the period of the warring states, or the period of lots of different countries in Europe having nationalist identities. And then the people realize that's a dangerous thing and they move back. So perhaps we can find a logic in this apparent chaos. And so the philosophy of history is very interesting from that point of view. So
what is politics to philosophers? Even you see today, particularly some of the very charismatic politicians existing on the world stage. Of course, I've been using a very polite word to describe them.
Yes.
So what about them
But
in the eyes of philosophers?
This is what philosophers have tried to do, you know. There is a phrase that people use today, to speak truth to power. And I think that has been the function of philosophers from the time of Socrates and Confucius, to give some advice and wisdom to the ruling princes.
If they listen.
If they listen, but even Confucius was very aware that most of the time you're talking to a deaf ears. That's why you're looking for the one hope that you might be able to find the wise prince, the wise
That's why
king.
you travel so much around so many countries and nations in order to find that open ears.
That's right, and you know the same thing exactly for Plato. Plato was always dreaming of founding the perfect state, and so you know he went to Italy to try. He went there to try to establish a perfect state, but it didn't succeed. So sadly, we learned the lesson that human beings perhaps have agendas that won't listen to philosophy. But nevertheless, that doesn't a reason for philosophy to stop saying the truth or seeking the truth.
Some of my journalistic friends have the habit now to get up every morning and check the Twitter to see what that guy has been saying over the night. Of course, that's only one of those phenomena that people have these days about how politics, personalities are brushing off their life.
Yes.
To a philosopher, how do you see this phenomenon that we are so much impacted by someone who is not necessarily that relevant, actually, to the real lives of us, and yet this phenomenon with the technologies, we are eager to know something that is actually not that important?
Yes, that is of course the nature of modernity, especially the modern media.
Yes.
Every philosopher in the 20th century has reflected on this problem, that we are living in an age of mass communication, and maybe that means that what we learn is not so important. It's a kind of noise. Again, many philosophers like Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse, the German philosopher, talks a kind of about, he said, the one-dimensionality. So there's no longer a depth dimension. Everything is always just a superficial news story. Even the idea of news, that we only want to hear what is new, is a kind of psychological some condition for us now.
Spring, autumn, and warring states period of time, which is one of the time a lot of philosophical thoughts flourished. You see there are so many schools of thoughts. It really eventually, depending on their relationship and partnership with politics, that somewhat apparently decide on the fate of these philosophical thoughts.
Yes.
So what exactly to you, Professor, is the relationship between real philosophers, philosophies that survived, and politics?
Oh my God, that is a very difficult question.
I know, we could talk for 2 days,
yes,
right?
and of course it's one that philosophers have talked about. For example, French philosopher Michel Foucault, he likes to use the word knowledge power. He runs the two words together, which probably describes exactly the kind of dynamic that you've been talking about. Philosophies come to dominance largely depend on the political support that they get. But that's not always the case, you know. It's kind of an accident of history that the Roman Empire became Christian, for example. The Romans, having suppressed Christianity, then adopted it, and it became the official language of the empire and spread across Europe. Similar things happened with the cultures. So in China, I think myself that just like in the West, there are many, many different philosophies: Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Marxism. But there is something special about Confucianism that I think is reflective of Chinese culture. I think it's probably the strongest of those traditions within Chinese culture. So I think it will continue to flourish. People say the same thing, that the sort of what they call Judeo-Christian values are very deeply ingrained in the West. So I think that's something that maybe is deeper than just the superficial power structures.
Professor Moran, this year is special if you look at philosophy. Of course, 200 years anniversary of Karl Marx. That's been celebrated around the world. He has been a transcending figure at least in recent human history. On the other hand, this is also the year for China's reform and opening up. So this is all reflecting in the same year. I think to a philosopher like you, it must be quite interesting.
It's very interesting, and actually coming to China, we're beginning to understand more how the figure of Marx is understood. You can say, in a way, that Marx is Chinese in China. He's not the German philosopher.
Chinese version already.
There's a Chinese version. So Chinese Marxism is a very distinctive kind of Marxism, and it is not well understood in the West. So we don't fully understand it. And I think my own understanding in talking to people here is that it shows many, it comes to join many aspects of traditional Chinese culture, like the idea that there's a kind of dynamics in change. And that we have to recognize that, and that Marx's view of dialectics is a way of expressing what may in the past have been expressed by yin-yang, or kind of dialectics of affirmation and negation. So in China there's a kind of synthesis between Chinese and Marxist thought.
That's so interesting,
That's very
isn't it?
distinctive, yeah. And it's something that we don't know much about in the West, so we're looking forward to learning more about this.
I would like to invite you to help us understand our age today, if you can, with 2 or 3 adjectives to a philosopher.
Well, challenging, you have to say. This age is challenging. I think it's terrifying. We are at the brink of very, very major changes. We don't know where the future is going. And I think maybe wonderful, because philosophy is wonder.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor Moran, for being with us. All the best.
Thank you.
A great success to the Congress, of course.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's my exclusive interview with Professor Dermot Moran on the sideline of the 24th World Congress of Philosophy, co-organized by the Peking University. Well, that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and